A starving widow whispered her darkest secret to a stranger, never expecting those 3 words to change her family's life forever. The dust rose from the cracked earth like prayers ascending to an indifferent sky. Margaret Holloway stood at the window of the small farmhouse, watching the horizon swallow the last traces of orange and purple as evening settled over the Kansas prairie. Behind her, 5 children sat in various states of exhaustion, their small bodies arranged around an empty table that had once groaned under the weight of Sunday suppers and birthday celebrations. That was before Thomas died, before the drought, before the bankmen came with their papers and their apologetic smiles that never quite reached their cold eyes. Little Sarah, just 4 years old, tugged at her mother's threadbare dress. The fabric had been washed so many times it had lost all memory of its original blue color, fading to something between gray and surrender. Margaret looked down at her youngest daughter, seeing Thomas's eyes staring back at her from that small, trusting face. "Mama, my tummy hurts," Sarah whispered, as if speaking too loudly might make the hunger more real. Margaret knelt down and pulled the child close, feeling the sharp edges of ribs beneath the thin cotton dress. She had given her last portion to the children 3 days ago, telling them she had already eaten when they asked why her plate sat empty. Mothers learned to lie with love, she had discovered. They learned to smile while their stomachs cramped and twisted. "I know, sweetheart. I know it hurts." James, the eldest at 14, stood from his chair. He had grown too fast this past year, shooting up like a weed while the food grew scarce. His pants stopped well above his ankles now, and his wrists extended far beyond his shirt sleeves. He had tried to take on his father's responsibilities after the fever claimed Thomas last winter. But there was only so much a boy could do against forces that crushed grown men. "I could try the creek again," James offered, though they both knew the creek had dried to a trickle weeks ago. The fish were long gone, fled to deeper waters, or died in the shrinking pools. "No, James. It'll be dark soon." The twins, Peter and Paul, sat with their heads resting on the table. At 8 years old, they should have been running through fields, causing mischief, bringing home frogs in their pockets. Instead, they conserved energy the way old men conserved memories, hoarding every movement against the emptiness in their bellies. And then there was Eleanor, 12 years old, with her mother's auburn hair and her grandmother's stubborn chin. She had stopped speaking 2 days ago, as if words themselves required sustenance she could no longer spare. She sat by the cold fireplace, staring at ashes that had once been warmth, and now were only reminders of everything they had lost. Margaret straightened up and smoothed her apron, a gesture so automatic she didn't realize she was doing it. The apron served no purpose now. There was nothing to cook, nothing to wipe clean, nothing to protect her dress from splashes of broth or dusting of flour. "We should try to sleep," she said, though night had become the hardest time. The darkness amplified every growl and gurgle from empty stomachs. The children whimpered in their dreams, reaching for food that existed only in the cruel theater of their unconscious minds. That was when they heard the hoofbeats. The sound was so foreign, after weeks of isolation, that at first Margaret thought she had imagined it. But James moved to the window, and his sharp intake of breath confirmed what her ears had suggested. "Someone's coming, Mama. A rider." Fear and hope tangled in Margaret's chest, fighting for dominance. A stranger could mean danger. These desperate times had turned good men bad and bad men worse. But a stranger could also mean help, and hope was something she couldn't quite kill no matter how hard reality tried. "Take the children to the back room," she whispered to James. "Don't come out unless I call for you." "But Mama." "Go. Now." James gathered his siblings with quiet efficiency, lifting Sarah onto his hip while ushering the twins with his free hand. Eleanor followed silently, a ghost drifting through her own life. Within moments, Margaret stood alone in the main room, her hand resting on the rifle that hung above the fireplace. Thomas had taught her to shoot years ago, insisting that a woman alone on the prairie needed to know how to defend herself. She had laughed then, never imagining a time when she would truly be alone. The hoofbeats slowed, then stopped. She heard the creak of leather as the rider dismounted, then footsteps approaching the door, heavy but unhurried. Not the footsteps of a man looking to cause trouble, but not the footsteps of someone expected either. The knock came, 3 solid raps that echoed through the empty house. Margaret considered not answering. She could pretend they had already left, already joined the exodus of families heading west toward rumors of rain and fertile land. But something in those knocks spoke of patience, of a man willing to wait, and she knew that pretending would only delay the inevitable. She opened the door. The man standing on her porch looked like he had been carved from the same leather as his saddle. His face was weathered and brown, creased with lines that spoke of decades spent squinting into sun and wind. A gray mustache curved around his mouth, and his eyes, the color of prairie sky before a storm, held a depth of experience that seemed almost infinite. He wore the clothes of a working cowboy, dusty and practical, and his hat had seen enough summers to tell its own stories. "Evening, ma'am," he said, tipping his hat. His voice was like gravel smoothed by a river, rough but somehow gentle. "Evening." Margaret kept her hand near the rifle, though she didn't reach for it. Something about this man didn't trigger her fear. Something about him felt like the answer to a question she had been too afraid to ask. "Name's William Corbin. Folks call me Will." He glanced past her into the dim interior of the house, and his eyes seemed to catalog everything in that single look. The empty table, the cold fireplace, the desperate cleanliness of a home that had nothing left but pride. "Margaret Holloway. Mrs. Holloway, I was passing through and saw your place from the ridge. Thought I might water my horse at your well if you don't mind." Margaret felt the familiar flush of shame heat her cheeks. "The well's dry, Mr. Corbin. Has been for 2 weeks now. We've been collecting what dew we can, and there's a spring about a mile east that still has some water, but the well—" She trailed off, unable to finish the sentence. Will nodded slowly, his eyes never leaving her face. He saw, she realized. He saw everything. The hollowness of her cheeks, the way her dress hung loose on a frame that had once been healthy and strong, the desperation she tried so hard to hide behind courtesy and composure. "Your husband around?" "My husband passed last winter. Fever took him." "I'm sorry to hear that." And he sounded like he meant it. Not the way the bank men had sounded sorry, but in a way that carried the weight of genuine understanding. "Children?" Margaret hesitated. Every instinct told her to lie, to protect her babies by pretending they didn't exist. But something in this man's eyes made lying seem both pointless and unnecessary. 5. They're in the back room. Will was quiet for a long moment, looking out at the darkening prairie as if reading something written in the land itself. Finally, he turned back to her. "When did you last eat, Mrs. Holloway?" The question was so direct, so unadorned with the politeness that usually cushions such inquiries, that Margaret found herself answering before she could construct a suitable deflection. 3 days. 4 for me." She expected pity. She expected the uncomfortable shuffling of a man who had asked a question and received more truth than he wanted. What she did not expect was the simple nod, as if he had confirmed something he already suspected. "Go get your children, Mrs. Holloway. I don't— Please, go get them." Margaret found herself moving toward the back room, drawn by something in his voice that wouldn't accept refusal. She opened the door to find 5 pairs of eyes staring at her, wide with fear and hope and hunger. "Come on," she said softly. "All of you, come on out." They emerged like animals from a burrow, cautious and blinking. Sarah clung to James's leg, peering at the stranger from behind her brother's protective stance. The twins held hands, their mirror faces reflecting identical uncertainty. Eleanor drifted out last, her eyes briefly meeting Will's before dropping back to the floor. Will studied each child in turn, his expression unreadable. Then he reached into his saddlebag, which he had carried in with him, and began pulling out packages wrapped in cloth and paper. I was heading to town, he said conversati. Only, as if this were the most natural thing in the world. Had these supplies, and realized I bought too much for one man. Jerky here, some dried fruit, biscuits from the last town, coffee, sugar, flowers, some salt pork. Shame to let it go to waste. Margaret started to protest, the words rising automatically. They couldn't accept charity. They had nothing to offer in return. Pride demanded she refuse, even as her children's eyes grew wide at the sight of actual food. But Will raised a hand, stopping her before she could speak. Before you say anything, let me tell you a story. Won't take long. He settled into one of the chairs at the table, and the children unconsciously gathered closer, drawn by his presence like planets to a sun. 30 years ago, I was about James's age here. My father had died in a mining accident. My mother had taken ill, and I was trying to provide for 3 younger sisters on a cowhand's wages. One winter, things got so bad I was eating snow to fill my belly, giving every scrap I could find to my mother and sisters. He paused, and Sarah, emboldened by hunger and curiosity, climbed into the chair next to him. Will smiled at her, and it transformed his weathered face into something almost kind. A man came through our town that winter, stranger like me. He saw our situation, and he did something that changed my life. He didn't give us charity, he gave us a chance. Bought supplies, same as these, but before he left, he made me promise something. What did you promise? Sarah asked, her voice small and serious. He made me promise that someday, when I was able, I would do the same for someone else. Pass it on, he said. That's how grace works. It doesn't stay in one place. It moves. It grows. Will looked at Margaret, his gray eyes holding hers with an intensity that made her breath catch. I've been looking for 30 years to keep that promise. Spent my life working cattle, saved more than I spent, never had a family of my own. But I kept looking, kept watching for the moment when I could do what that man did for me. He gestured at the table, now covered with more food than they had seen in months. This isn't charity, Mrs. Holloway. This is a promise being kept. And all I ask is that someday, when you're able, you pass it on. Margaret felt tears sliding down her cheeks, the first she had allowed herself since Thomas died. She had been so strong for so long, holding everything together through sheer force of will. But kindness, unexpected and unearned, shattered her defenses in ways that hardship never could. I don't know what to say. Don't say anything. Feed your children. And so she did. She prepared the first real meal they had eaten in weeks, hands shaking as she worked with ingredients she had begun to think she might never touch again. The children watched in silent reverence as jerky and biscuits and dried apple slices appeared on plates before them. Even Eleanor, silent for days, whispered a thank you before taking her first bite. Will ate with them, sharing their meal as if he were a long-lost uncle returned from some distant journey. He told stories of cattle drives and desert sunsets, of rivers forded and storms survived. The children listened with rapt attention, their mouths full for the first time in memory, their eyes reflecting firelight from the blaze James had built in the resurrected hearth. Later, after the children had fallen into the deep sleep of the truly satisfied, Margaret sat with Will on the porch, watching stars emerge across the vast prairie sky. "What will you do now?" he asked. "I don't know. The bankmen will be back soon. We're 3 months behind on the mortgage. Even with food, we can't stay here much longer." Will was quiet for a moment. He reached into his pocket and withdrew a folded paper. "I told you I never had a family, never had anyone to leave things to. But I've got a small ranch about 50 miles north of here. Nothing fancy, but the land's good, there's water, and the house is sturdy. I've been looking for someone to take it over, someone who needs a fresh start." Margaret stared at him, unable to process what he was saying. "The paper's already drawn up. All legal. You just need to sign it and the place is yours. Free and clear. I can't. This is too much. You don't even know us. I know enough. Will stood, his old joints creaking in protest. I know a mother who's given everything for her children. I know young ones who've suffered more than they should. And I know that sometimes the universe puts people in our path for a reason. He placed the paper on the railing beside her. I'll be moving on in the morning, heading south. Getting too old for Kansas winters. But before I go, I want you to understand something. He leaned down, his face close to hers, his voice dropping to a whisper that carried the weight of 30 years of waiting. You and your children will never go hungry again. Not because of this food, not because of that ranch, but because you've got strength in you, Mrs. Holloway. The kind of strength that drought can't kill and loss can't break. I've seen it. Your children have seen it. Now it's time for you to see it too. Margaret looked up at this stranger who had ridden out of the dying day like an answer to prayers she had forgotten how to pray. The words caught in her throat, thick with emotion and gratitude and something that felt remarkably like hope. Thank you, she finally managed. Will smiled, the lines of his face rearranging themselves into a map of kindness. Don't thank me. Thank that stranger from 30 years ago. And someday, when your child, Wren are grown and strong, when they've built lives of their own on that good land, make sure they know to watch for strangers who need help. Make sure they know how to pass it on. He tipped his hat and walked to where his horse waited, patient and steady as its master. Margaret watched him mount, watched him turn toward the road, watched his silhouette merge with the darkness until she couldn't tell where man ended and night began. In the morning, he was gone. But on the table sat the deed to a ranch, signed and witnessed and ready for her signature. Beside it, a note in careful handwriting. The place is called Hope Springs. Seemed fitting. The foreman knows you're coming. W.C. Margaret gathered her children around her and told them they were going home. It was a home they had never seen, on land they had never walked, but somehow, impossibly, it was home. And as they loaded their few possessions into the wagon and pointed themselves north toward a future they had stopped believing in, Margaret made a promise of her own. Someday, somehow, she would find a stranger in need. She would pass on the grace that had been passed to her. She would tell the story of the cowboy who rode out of the sunset and gave them back their lives.